Alright, class, getting ready for our next lecture. Let's go ahead and get the camera centered a little. Not sure why I've got that little rainbow effect on the screen, but hey, we all need a little merriment sometimes. Anyway, this is post-war society and culture, period from 1945 to 1960. Now, the biggest thing in this lecture, we're going to kind of overlap a little bit about what we talked about with Truman and Cold War America. This is going to be talking more about American society during this time. And the biggest thing to know is we were a people of incredible plenty. Indeed, in the post-war economy, instead of worrying about going into a depression, the dominant feature of the American economy was our incredible prosperity. I mean, our gross national product more than doubled from 1945 to 1960. Perpetual growth was now seen as possible and desirable. Indeed, by 1970, the gap between the living standards of Americans to the rest of the world was widening. With 6% of the world's population, America produced and consumed 2/3 of the world's goods. Indeed, by the 1950s, the government is telling the people that never again shall we allow a depression in the United States. Now, why is this going on? Well, the reasons for their economic growth was we had high government spending sustained in the post-war era due to tensions generated by the Cold War. I mean, the Korean conflict ensured military spending. In fact, military spending after 1945 was an important stimuli to the post-war economic boom. Like defense research helped spawn glamour industries of the post-war period, like chemicals, electronics, aviation. And of course, like I told you last lecture, the sudden influx of veterans as new workers might have sent the economy into a downward spiral, but the Veterans Administration, a new government agency, included provisions for mustering out, including pay, unemployment for a year, preference for civil service jobs, loans for home construction, government hospitals, and subsidies for college or professional training. Indeed, you had almost 8 million vets that took advantage of the $14.5 million GI Bill. 5 million used additional monies to buy new homes. And these two steps combined to produce a social revolution. Indeed, it opened the door to college to many that hadn't had that before. I mean, before World War II, 160,000 people graduated from college. By 1950, we have 500,000. And indeed, in 1949, veterans accounted for 40% of college enrollments, giving the U.S. the best educated workforce. Now, of course, we're less successful in dealing with racial barriers. That rainbow, I don't like it. For example, of the 9,000 students in the University of Pennsylvania in 1946, only 46 of them were African Americans. And of course, they were barred from playing on athletic teams, attending social events, or joining the Greek system. Now, some of you might say, well, what about the historically black colleges like Grambling? And these are mainly in the South. Well, the problem there is they couldn't expand quickly enough to meet the new demand. Indeed, in 1940, black colleges enrolled 43,000. By 1950, they enrolled 77,000, with 20,000 denied admission, simply because of the lack of space. Now, as a result of this lack of space, most black vets didn't go to college. Indeed, by 1946, only a fifth of the 100,000 who applied for educational benefits have been able to enroll. Getting ready to go to the next slide. Now, meanwhile, America has a monopoly. I mean, unlike the major industrial nations of the world, like Germany, England, France, Japan, the USSR, the Americans had not been physically devastated by World War II, meaning we had an almost monopoly on international trade. In addition, the automation of the workforce created spectacular increases in productivity. For example, in 1945, it took 310 hours to build a car. Due to automation, by 1955, that number is down to only 150 hours. And not only that, but we have an outburst of babies in what was called the baby boom that peaked in 1957. This gave the Americans something new that would constantly need new items. You know, we got to buy a baby crib, we got to buy baby furniture, we got to buy baby clothes. Oh, they grew out of it. Now we got to buy little person clothes. Oh, they grew out of it. Well, now we got to yada yada. Getting ready to go to the next slide. Consumer culture. Homeownership increased 50% from 1945 to 1960. And as it increased, the people are going to need new goods to fill their houses with. Well, of course, at the factories, they produce a huge variety of goods. I mean, we got refrigerators, washing machines, sewing machines, vacuum cleaners, freezers, mixers, carving knives. I mean, the list goes on. And not just one company is making them. All these different companies are making all these goods. Is my focus a little soft? So now that you have all these goods out there, how are you going to get the word out to the people about what goods to buy? Well, we got a brand new invention. The television. In 1946, there were 7,000 primitive black and white TVs. But by 1960, we had 50 million quality sets. Indeed, 9 out of 10 homes had one. By 1970, 38% had one of the brand new color TVs. Indeed, TV Guide was the fastest growing new periodical of the late 1950s. And a funny little thing is that in 1953, Business Week noted that city engineers across the country discovered erratic surges in water consumption, where nothing would go on for about 15 minutes, then all of a sudden there'd be a huge usage, and then there'd be like 15 more minutes of quiet, then there'd be a huge use. Guys, basically people were going to the bathroom during commercial breaks. I'll go to the next slide in a second. Going to the next slide. Now, of course, we have increased purchasing. Even though the gaps between the haves and the have-nots grew during this period, I mean, you still had your rural and your urban poor that persisted. But for the growing middle class, weekly visits to beauty parlors or shopping centers became routine activities for many working class housewives. Indeed, during this time, family with 2 cars was not uncommon. And some might also have a camper or even a boat. Indeed, the head of the AFL-CIO, George Meany, stated American labor had never had it so good. Indeed, by 1950, blacks were earning on average 4 times their 1940 wages, prompting one black journalist to declare in 1951 the progressive improvement of race relations and the economic rise of the Negro in the United States is a flattering example of democracy in action. And even though it sounds good, the gap between the yearly income between blacks and whites continued to grow. But we're not really paying attention to it. Why? Because, guys, this is an age of conformity. Getting ready to go to the next slide. Okay. The role of advertising. Basically, during this time, marketeers really pushed self-gratification. You have planned obsolescence, or something that goes obsolete, start to become more and more in the way of selling more goods from many manufacturers. Advertising was a central component to this push. I mean, you had TV advertising expenditures increased 1,000% during the 1940s, prompting NBC in 1956 to state, advertising has created an American form of mind that makes people want more things, better things, newer things. Well, how are people gonna pay for this? Well, guys, paying for it was no problem, as from 1945 to 1957, consumer credit soared by more than 800%. So while the rest of the world is saving between 10 to 20% of its salary, Americans in the 1960s saved only 5%. Making a situation where never before had so much been owed by so many. Getting ready to go to the next slide. Well, what are some of the cultural effects of this? Well, we got new places to spend. Shopping centers sweep the nation. In 1945, we only had 8 of them. By 1960, we had 3,840. You also have something like the indoor shopping malls that started to appear. Now, what's the effect of this on young people? Well, the baby boomer generation became adolescents in the 1950s, and this was a generation that had never known want. Teens had more money and more free time than any prior generation. Shopping became increasingly important for them, because they had a vast new market for goods. You had goods like the hula hoop, skateboards, bikes, cameras, rock and roll records, 17 magazine, transistor radios. And you got these kids with disposable incomes with allowances of $10 to $15 compared to $2 in the 1940s. These kids, kind of like us, were immersed in an abundance from an early age. Indeed, you had one girl who got a $65 monthly allowance that said, I have to save $10, but the rest is mine to do what I want to with. I spent about $40 on clothes and all the rest on records and jewelry. All the teenagers are on that swing. We just find it neat to spend money. Now, what about the parents? Well, the parents are more permissive, prompting one commentator to call the American family a child-centered anarchy. By 1956, you have more than 1 million teens arrested each year. Biggest crimes were like car theft, larceny, rape, beatings, murder. You might see some of the aspects of self-gratification prompting those. But what are we going to blame this sweeping juvenile crime craze on? Well, some claimed it was a lack of religious teaching. Others claimed that it was their use of automobile that gave them too much freedoms. But finally, some level-headed people pointed out that it was the new frenzied music craze, rock and roll. A name came up by Alan Freed, a disc jockey in Cleveland, who noted that teens were buying rhythm and blues records that had previously been bought by black and Chicano listeners. He wanted to then bring what was called race music to a teen audience. So he began playing the records and calling it rock and roll to cross the racial divide. You had early performers like Chuck Berry, Ray Charles, Buddy Holly, Richie Valens, who actually his original name was Richie Valenzuela, but he changed it. These records suddenly become all the rage, inspiring a young white truck driver born in Tupelo, Mississippi, raised in Memphis, to begin experimenting with his own rockabilly music, a mixture of gospel, country, and western with rock and roll rhythms and lyrics. This man quickly rose to prominence, his long hair and sideburns accentuated by his sneers, clad in a tight leather jacket and suggestively tight blue jeans. He became so popular that his dangerously suggestive dancing on stage was censored in his first tremendously popular Ed Sullivan appearance. It was shot only from the waist up. Well, who was this singer, this hero, this bad boy yet all-American? It was Elvis Presley. Oh, and by the way, guys, for those of you that think Elvis wasn't that big of a deal, Elvis has still sold more records than the Beatles. Now, this music was so dangerous that some claimed it inspired communism, but all assaults on this new form of music only seemed to add to its appeal. And in audiences, this music represented an unprecedented interminglement of racial, ethnic, and class identities. Getting ready to go to the next slide. Now, where are the people going? They're going out to suburbia that had most of the population growth in America was urban and suburban, with almost the entire growing population increase in the 1950s and 60s being urban or suburban, 97%. Now, why were people going out to the suburbs? Why did they leave Dallas to go to Plano? Why did they leave Plano to go to Rowlett? Well, guys, basically, they had more spacious homes, greater security and educational opportunities. And a lot of this population growth took place in a location known as the Sun Belt. And it was thanks to an invention by Willis Haviland Carrier way back in the 1890s. Now, the Sun Belt was the South, the Southwest, and the West, in an area that stretched from the Carolinas through Texas out to California. Now, what did Willis Haviland Carrier create? Well, you may not know it, but if it ever goes out on you in a Texas summer, you will certainly feel it. The air conditioner. Now, I told you you'd created the first one back in 1890, and it wasn't until the 1950s that we had the technology to make the units small enough and cheap enough that they could be affordable. And it became a common household fixture. Now you have all this boom going along in the Sun Belt, but the Northeast remained and still remains one of the most densely populated, with 20% of the national population living in the corridor stretching from Boston to Norfolk, Virginia. Now, suburbia. Post-World War II, Americans were spreading out within metropolitan areas. Indeed, by 1950, the Census Bureau redefined urban to include suburbs as well as the central cities. So during the 1950s, each day, 3,000 acres of grassland and forests were being bulldozed for the new suburban housing developments. And you have the suburbs growing 6 times faster than the cities. Indeed, by 1970, more Americans lived in the suburbs at 76 million than in the central cities at only 64 million. Now, why did that happen? We're going to get to that in the next slide. The reason for the suburban growth. Well, an excellent thing to look at is Levittown and mass production. Basically, William Levitt was a New York developer who was a leader in the suburban revolution. He and his brother built homes and made a fortune. Now, this is during the Great Depression. And after the war, he struck it rich when he developed an efficient means of mass-producing homes. You know, where you can either have home style A, home style B, or home style C, where all the homes kind of look like each other. And after the war, in 1947, he bought 1,200 acres of Long Island farmland and built 10,600 homes on that land that were immediately sold and inhabited by more than 40,000 people, mainly young adults under 35 and their kids. I don't know if y'all have ever heard of the he used to be a TV host and author, Bill O'Reilly. Bill O'Reilly's dad bought one of those. He lived in Levittown. Now, how did the government help out? Well, low-cost loans were offered with the government helping to insure homeowners up to 95% of the value of their homes. The Federal Housing Administration made it easy for a builder to construct low-cost homes. So if you were a vet or a veteran, you could buy a Levitt home with no down payment at all and monthly mortgage installments of only $56. Now, also connecting the suburbs to the cities and to each other, you had automobiles and highways with expanded automobile production and highway construction facilitating the rush to the suburbs. Car production went from 2 million in 1946 to more than 8 million by 1955. You have local and state governments that built many new roads. But the federal system got involved in 1947 when Congress authorized the construction of 42,000 additional miles of highways. Now, during this time, blacks also migrated to the cities of the North and Midwest. And when that occurred, white neighbors would usually move out. It was called white flight. In many of the new suburbs, they passed obvious discrimination that refused to allow members of other than the Caucasian race. And by the way, guys, just so you know, that others than the Caucasian race, that pretty much gave the housing administrators, if you were Jewish, if you were Irish, if you're Italian, Asian, they didn't like you, they'd keep you out. And the nation's suburban population in 1970 was 95% white. Ready to go to the next slide? Now, once again, we're talking about the Great Migration, where World War II helped spur migration of rural blacks to northern urban centers. After 1945, more than 5 million southern blacks went north in search of better jobs, higher wages, better housing, greater social equality. What prompted this? Well, in 1944, a machine was invented that could do the work of 50 people. So less people are needed. And you have these displaced southern blacks streaming northward. Places like Chicago, Philadelphia, Newark, Detroit, New York, Boston, Washington, D.C. And instead of finding a utopia, many found the same harsh realities they had left. You had slumlords gouging them for rent, employers refusing to hire them, unions denying them membership. Basically, they were thrown into high project slums. Like Chicago during the 1950s, their African American population doubled as they received more than 3,000 migrants a day. And attempts were made to alleviate racial hostility by placing many black migrants into all-black housing, public housing projects, which pretty much laid the framework for the complex social problems that would flare up in the 1960s. Now, one group, getting ready to go to the next slide. Where do I have it? 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 I'm showing you everything. Well, what are we going to do about it? Is the government going to do anything? Well, basically, Eisenhower's stance was he did want to try to integrate, but we still had a segregated America where we had things for blacks only, for whites only. But you do have the case of Brown versus the Topeka Board of Education. Brown was just the main client listed, basically saying that separate but equal is not true and cannot happen. For example, because they're separate, they're never going to be equal. And I can tell you this, we have an example of something at schools that proves this exactly. Bathrooms. You have boys' bathrooms, you have girls' bathrooms. Well, guys, they're supposed to be equal, but you probably won't find any urinals in a female bathroom, and you're going to find a whole lot more toilets in a ladies' bathroom. They might also have dispensaries that men's bathrooms don't have. Anyway, Thurgood Marshall, the head attorney, basically said that separate was not equal. Goes all the way to the Supreme Court, where they were found correct when it comes to the school system. And basically the Supreme Court agreed with him. Because guys, this integration, a lot of people weren't ready for it. So they legally said the school had to be integrated with all possible speed, giving districts the time to cultivate their students. Here in Dallas, our superintendent of schools was slow in his integration, but then John F. Kennedy was assassinated here, and because of that, our mayor, Erickson, wanted Dallas to appear to be a city of the future, so they really accelerated the integration here in Dallas. The superintendent who did it, first they started integrating the primary schools, then the junior highs, and then the high schools. His name was W.T. White, and there's actually a high school here in Dallas named after him. Anyway, well, you had that decision, but was society ready to continue moving on slow? No. On December 1st, 1955, you have Rosa Parks, who made her stand against racism by sitting down. And a white man got on the bus. He wanted her seat. She refused to stand and give it to him, and she was thrown off the bus. Now, guys, what a lot of people don't know is that Rosa Parks was a secretary at the NAACP branch. Basically a woman who, the very same thing that Rosa Parks did, it had happened to her about a week earlier. But she wasn't pretty, she was an unwed mother, she didn't make an ideal poster child. So, the NAACP got Rosa Parks to get on the bus, believing it would happen. The event happened, and that's why that case got known. Well, a young pastor who just started working at the Ebenezer Baptist Church, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., took up the cause, and they called for the Montgomery bus boycott, working together with the Southern Christian Leadership Committee. And basically, blacks would stop riding on the bus. Now, guys, when you do a boycott, boycotts cost. Okay? You can't just say a line on Facebook or change your profile picture to have some meme on it. Basically, you had blacks that would walk for up to 3 miles. They had to have huge carpools, or they might have to get up an hour early and get home an hour later. But they kept to their guns. And basically the Montgomery Bus Company started losing money, losing so much money that after many months of this boycott, they finally acquiesced and desegregated the buses. Getting ready to go to the next slide. Now, civil rights. Civil rights was full of responses. You had the Civil Rights Act of 1957 that was passed. And in Little Rock, they were going to slowly begin the integration at a place called Central High School. But Orville Flavus, their governor, refused to do that. He said basically that it was a states' rights issue, not a federal issue, to allow this integration at the high school. So, how did Eisenhower respond? He sent down a battalion to make sure that those students did get into their classrooms. Indeed, Norman Rockwell painted a very picture for Life magazine of the little girl walking in front of the school. You see the brick wall in the background with tomatoes that are thrown at her. This picture was so provocative that basically he lost his job. He got fired. But he got another job just a few weeks later because he was so talented. Okay, getting ready to go to the next slide. Meanwhile, Puerto Ricans. During 1953, you had the Puerto Ricans immigration to New York that reached 75,000, as now we had air travel becoming cheap to many, and many Puerto Ricans were trying to deal with industrial displacement at their home in Puerto Rico. The New York mayor, Robert Wagner Jr., tried to attract the population, believing they would be a cheap and welcome workforce. However, there was, even though it was never really carried out, an attempted assassination on Truman that never really got past the planning stage, called the Blair House Plan by the Puerto Rican Nationalist Party. And this basically began to negatively paint the community. Indeed, by the 1950s, restaurants hung up signs reading "No dogs or Puerto Ricans allowed." Indeed, one movie and musical that tried to display this tension was a West Side Story movie about a Polish guy, an American, but he's of Polish descent, who falls. He's the leader of one gang, and he falls for the sister, who's Puerto Rican, of the other gang. I mean, it's kind of a modern telling of Romeo and Juliet. The cast starred it actually had Puerto Ricans as the Puerto Ricans, except for a young Natalie Wood, because it was thought that having a Hispanic and a white guy was too inflammatory. But it gave rise to like Rita Moreno. So it was a very progressive piece. Great film. If you haven't seen it, check it out. And basically by 1960, the U.S. Census stated that New York had a population of more than 600,000 Puerto Ricans. Now we're a conforming culture. corporate life. Now, much of what was faced in American life during this period was the creation of pretty much a homogenized culture. You had suburban life that encouraged conformity, where they worked at, promoted conformity. On the new TVs, everyone was watching the box that presented them what the new normal family should appear like on TV. Now you had the growth of the middle class. By the mid-50s, white collar workers outnumbered blue collar workers for the first time in American history. Remember, a blue collar worker is someone who has an office job, and a blue collar worker is someone who's a laborer. And indeed, 60% of the population enjoyed a middle-class standard of living, whereas in 1931, only 31% of the population was so lucky. Okay, sorry about that. I had to get my dog to quiet down. Now, also you have most of this new class that I was talking about with the middle class have jobs like managers, teachers, professors, researchers, salespeople, government employees, as well as other workers. Now you have the growth of big business. Basically, after World War II, big business grew even bigger. The government relaxed a lot of their antitrust activity, and huge defense contracts prompted corporation. By the 1940s, 100 companies were responsible for 30% of all the manufacturing output. 3 years later, they were responsible for 70%. Okay, we're getting ready to go on to the next slide. Now, what was a woman's place during this time? Well, Life magazine in 1956 featured the ideal middle-class woman. She was 32, pretty and popular, a suburban housewife, a mother of 4 who had married at 16. She was an excellent wife, mother, volunteer, and home manager who made her own clothes, hosted dozens of dinner parties, sang in the church choir, worked with the school PTA, the Campfire Girls, and was devoted to her husband. Well, guys, what happened to the cult of domesticity? Remember that we talked about? Well, the baby boom actually reinforced the notion that a woman's place was in the home. After working in the factories during the war, they were forced to give up their jobs and go home. Indeed, a Bernard College trustee asserted in 1950 that women must boldly announce that there is no more exacting, more necessary, or more rewarding than that of being a housewife and mother. You had 2 social scientists, Mary Farnham and Ferdinand Lundberg, who published Modern Woman, The Lost Sex, where they stated they could scientifically prove that women would only be fulfilled by accepting their natural functions as housewives and mothers. Getting ready to go to the next slide. Now, do we have anything else that's kind of supporting this conformity? Well, during this time period, you had social organizations seeing an incredible rise in membership. Americans joined civic clubs, garden clubs, bridge clubs, babysitting groups. Basically, it provided the middle class a growing sense of community. Now, why did they need community so bad? Well, if you have a job and you get a promotion, you might have to move to another city. And in that city, like if you're a member of the Rotary Club in Dallas and you're going to move to San Antonio, they'll say, oh, well, go down and see Red in the San Antonio Rotary Club and tell them you know me, Chuck. And you get in there, and then that'll allow you access to more points of community. And indeed, it should come as no surprise that there was an increase in church membership. In 1940, less than 50% of the adult population belonged to churches, but by 1960, that number is at 65% that belonged to churches. Yet sales of Bibles soared, as did books, movies, and songs with religious themes. Now, were there other reasons for this religious revival? Well, the prevailing tone in a lot of these churches was upbeat and soothing. Congregants basically wanted to be reassured that their own comfortable lives was God's will. Because, guys, we live incredibly well in America. Now, Eisenhower believed that recognition of a supreme being is the first, most basic expression of Americanism. Without God, there could be no American form of government, nor an American way of life. Now, do you all agree with that? A lot of you might not, because you've been so, no, there needs to be a separation of church and state. And that's true. But why is God so important? Well, guys, look at our founding documents. We hold these truths to be self-evident. Battery just died, but we're back. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men have been granted rights by their Creator. Guys, we get our rights from our Creator. Government doesn't give us rights. You think, oh, well, government gave women the right to vote. Government was keeping those rights from women in the first place. Well, government ended slavery. Government had passed the rules that made slavery possible. Guys, it's your Creator that give you your rights. And Eisenhower said supreme being. So it can be anything you wanted to. There's an authority higher than you that gave you your rights, not the government. Remember, we talked in the first section, the only purpose of government is to limit your rights so that the sake of others are protected. Well, Congress in 1954 added "One Nation Under God" to our Pledge of Allegiance, and the following year they put "In God We Trust" on our money. Getting ready to go to the next slide. Now you really start to have the marketing of religion. I mean, billboards across the country began promoting local churches. TV commercials had an ad that said the family that prays together stays together. You had Catholic Bishop Fulton J. Sheen, who had a weekly television show that was a primetime hit. Meanwhile, Billy Graham used the radio and TV in promoting huge crusades. And to kind of show the connection between the car culture and religion, you had some churches performing services at drive-in movie theaters on Sundays, where the preacher could stand at the front and talk, and people could listen to the sermon on little speakers in their cars. Well, what was the message of popular religion? Basically, you had Reverend Norman Vincent Peale, who believed in positive thinking, start thinking faith, enthusiasm, and joy. And by following this, one could become a more popular, esteemed, and well-liked individual. Kind of like what Joel Osteen preaches. Ready to go to the next slide? Well, of course, not everybody has fallen into line with this. In the neo-orthodoxy, you do have many that began to say that the feel-good ministers were shallow and misleading and professed a religiousness without religion, a religiousness without with almost any kind of contact or none in the way of socially belonging rather than a way of reorienting the life towards God. You had guys like Reinhold Niebuhr, who lambasted the undue complacency and conformity that had settled over America. True peace, he insisted, involved not cheap comfort and sedating reassurances, but the reality of a pain caused by love and responsibility. Getting ready to go to the next slide. Cracks in the picture window. Well, guys, is everybody on board with this? Well, no. You had like economist John Gilbreth in his Affluent Society that attacked the prevailing notion that sustained economic growth would solve America's social problems while the public sector was starved for funds. You had public enterprises deteriorating despite all of our prosperity. We had yet to eradicate poverty. In John Keats' The Cracks in the Picture Window, he launched a savage attack on the mass-produced suburbia as having been conceived in error, nurtured in greed, corroding everything they touched, while its residents lived in neat rows of identical boxes spreading like gangrene. Basically, he called suburbia a homogeneous post-war hell. And then we get to David Reisman's Lonely Crowd. Guys, David Reisman sounds like a grumpy old man. His whole deal was that there's been a shift in the American personality from the inner directed to the outer directed. Inner directed types of people had a deeply internalized set of basic values implanted by strong-minded parents or elders. And this fixed set acted like an internal gyroscope, and once set in motion, inner-directed personalities had fixed values that kept them on course. They were self-assured, self-reliant. Personality had been the dominant American personality throughout most of the 19th century. But during the mid-20th century, you started to see the outer-directed personality creep in. Basically, modern capitalism emphasized manipulating workers, so employees who could win friends easily and influence were the wanted types. Outward directed people were more concerned with being well liked than with being independent. And you have this outer directed personality was then spilled over into the workplace throughout middle class life. Well, how is the artist going to deal with this? Getting ready to go to the next slide. You have alienation in Miller's Death of a Salesman. Basically, its main character, Willie Loman, is an aging, confused salesman in decline, whose success had always been seen by his family as the success he could bring home, bring them a nice living. And basically, he's not able to do that anymore. He believes himself to be a failure, is not happy. His sons aren't happy either. They're all desperately alone. The main theme was the sense of alienation that was experienced by sensitive individuals in the midst of an impressive mass culture. Well, what are authors saying? Getting ready to go to the next slide. In the novel, you have J.D. Salinger's Catcher in the Rye, which basically is the individual struggle for survival amid the smothering and disoriented forces of mass society. The main character, Holden Caulfield, finally decides that rebellion against conformity is useless. And I won't tell you what he does. Probably y'all had to read that book this year. If not, it is an incredible book about the mind of a 15-year-old boy. Basically, J.D. Salinger wrote it while he was in World War II. And that was part of his therapy that helped him get over his PTSD. After he got out, basically secluded himself. Other novels are like Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, Jones from Here to Eternity, and all others that kind of show this common theme of the search for the individual, separate from others. Especially Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man is about a black man who works for a white employer, that because he works for a white employer, he can't make any friends at work, and when he goes back home to his community, he's kind of looked at differently from his community because he works with white people. So he's the Invisible Man. An interesting book. In painting, you had like Edward Hopper, who explored the theme of desolate loneliness in urban industrial America. You have painters like Jackson Pollock, who was an abstract expressionist painter, who claimed that abstract art is an effort to close the void that modern men feel. Basically, this guy would place huge canvases on the floor and then walk around each side, pouring and dripping paint. It was basically known as the drip method. It was pretty revolutionary when it came out. Indeed, he was called America's Best Artist by Life magazine in 1949. And it's kind of sad because he got so good at his style that people wouldn't let him move on to other kinds of painting, and he was kind of done with drip painting. Indeed, he said, "The paint no longer speaks to me." And took to drink, and then he died in an automobile accident, I believe in 1954. Well, who else can we look at? All the Beats. These are the guys that are known as the Beatniks. These are people who believe the dynamic of life is the desire for pure freedom, the liberation of self-expression to surmount organizational constraints and discard conventional conventions. It was a collection of young writers, poets, painters, and musicians known as the Beats. Why were they known as the Beats? Because they were just beat tired of the world, man. I think that's on the next slide, but I wanted to give you all time to write this down. Next slide. Now, some of the leading, probably the leading figure of this movement was Jack Kerouac. He was tall, handsome, athletic, hard-working kid from Lowell, Massachusetts. He went to Columbia University on a football scholarship, but in 1943 he quit school to join the Navy. But if you couldn't guess, he soon grew tired of military discipline, laid down his gun, and went to the library. And basically he was discharged. You have Allen Ginsberg as a big name because of his poem Howl. And if you know what he looks like and you like Bob Dylan, you can see him in the background of one of the Bob Dylan videos by the can that has the fire burning in it. You have William Burroughs, A graduate of Harvard in 1936, he studied medicine. Then he worked as an advertising copywriter. He cut off one of his fingers during a Van Gogh kick. Later on, he became a heroin addict. And he accidentally killed his wife by trying to shoot an apple off her head. And when they was on trial for that, basically his parents had some property down in the valley in Texas, and they hustle-bucked him down to the valley just in case the trial went against him. He could just cross the border. And he also had Neil Cassidy, who was a 20-year-old ex-convict who arrived in New York from Denver. And even though he didn't write much, the guy was like full of emotional and sensual energy, as well as physical. Very inspiring to the people about him. What was their philosophy and works? Well, their quest for the visionary sensibility and spontaneous way of life, transforming themselves into reforming the world. They were mad to live, mad to talk, mad to be saved. But their road to salvation pretty much lay in drugs, alcohol, sex, a taste for jazz and the urban life, as well as an affinity to Buddhism, kind of a restless and vagabond spirit. Where are we going to go, man? I don't know, but we just got to go. You dig? Alright, getting ready to go to the next slide. Leads us into politics. Eisenhower's rise to the presidency. Now, Eisenhower, who had been in the military, basically he could have run either as a Democrat or a Republican. They would have loved him either way. He ran for the Republican Party. The Democrats ran against him, Adlai Stevenson. The Republicans believed it was time for a change. Originally, the frontrunner was Robert A. Taft, but they dropped him as soon as Eisenhower showed that he was interested in the nomination. For his vice president, he got Richard Milhous Nixon to be his vice president, an incredibly political guy, who back even then there had been some allegations of him accepting bribes and gifts from foreign dignitaries. Well, what did Nixon do with this? Instead of running from it, he confronted it when he appeared on TV, where he told the people that he and his wife, Pat, y'all have been accusing me of accepting gifts from foreign governments, and I'm here to tell you that we did. And then he steps over. Behind him on a podium was his dog, Checkers. We got our dog, Checkers. It was a gift from the English, and we're not going to give it back. And of course, that just made people love him even more. Next slide. Results, basically, Eisenhower wins. Now, as president, I told you, as a general, he would lay out the big pictures of things that needed to be taken care of and leave it to those underneath him to accomplish the goals. And his presidential style followed that. Basically, he was the big idea man. And people underneath him would put that plan into fruition the best way they saw fit. Basically, this was called a dynamic conservatism. As things would change, but not to upset the boat. Ready to go to the next slide? Korea. Well, Korea had pretty much come to a stalemate. I'd already told you that when we were talking about Korea. But then, like I told you, the stalemate might be broken. Especially as there were secret threats that we were going to restart the offensive. And basically take it all the way up through China. What does this result in? It results in basically China letting it be known that North Korea says they want an end to a war. And we already talked about that with the last lecture. We also started talking about good old Tail Gunner Joe last lecture and what happened to McCarthyism. Well, the movement was incredibly strong. Once again, I told you they could accuse almost anybody. But then they televised. He'd agree that he'd show up on TV when he was doing a case against the army. And of course, you did have some reporters that were showing films of him contradicting himself in public. And basically, he brought his own self kind of down. But this wasn't before you had like J. Robert Oppenheimer removed from the Carnegie Foundation. And I told you that last time. Because it was seen as a security risk. Next slide. Now, what's our foreign policy during the first term? Next slide. Well, basically, you had John Foster Dulles, who had worked with the CIA. And basically, our foreign policy was we would help out those who were our friends and try to destabilize those who were seen as our enemies. And basically anybody who was communist or a communist country was seen as our enemy because of good old George Kennan, who began America on the policy of containment. And basically this policy of containment was met out. Wherever the Soviets were, we would meet them in strength. But to our friends, we had the policy of liberation, where we'd give them money, we'd help out their army, we'd support social things. Ready for the next slide? Covert actions. Basically, the role of the CIA during this period was once again to destabilize those that we saw as our enemies, because you couldn't go in there with big armies and do stuffs because it might start a nuclear war. So what are the results of the CIA? Well, you have foreign governments like deposed and new ones put in, like in Iran and Guatemala. In Iran, the Shah returned power. Right? Dulles in containment. How are we going to contain the Russians? Well, basically through the promise of massive retaliation. In other words, if you hit us, we are going to hit you back so hard that you shouldn't even consider hitting us. And basically that caused them to kind of approach us the same way. So politically, the relationship between the Americans and the Soviet bloc was one of brinkmanship. Where you're always on the brink, moves aren't too big. Ready for the next slide? Which brings us to Indochina. In Indochina, this is like where Vietnam, Thailand, Cambodia, Laos are, that were French colonies that France got back after the war. And France wanted to maintain them as colonies. Meanwhile, Ho Chi Minh, who lived in the north of Vietnam, he wanted an independent Vietnam. And even though he had been with America, or he had supported America during World War II, well, now that France is back, and France is a big country that we can deal with, and Ho Chi Minh is a communist, because of containment, we got to stand strong against him. Which, of course, also is going to bring conflict between Ho Chi Minh and France, who's trying to suppress the communists. Now, why is America worried if communism wins in Southeast Asia? Well, that's because of something called the domino theory, where basically if one of the nations falls to communism, all the other nations are going to be similar. They're also going to fall. We ready? All right, next slide. So Vietnam gets split. They finally do kick out the French after France's disastrous defeat at Dien Bien Phu, where they built up an airfield and a military headquarters in the middle of a valley that was supposed to be able to go out and address anything that the Vietnamese were doing. Well, they then used their time to build up a big army with a lot of support from Russia, of course, and basically attacked Dien Bien Phu, and the Vietnamese won. And basically, we had the Geneva Accords, where Vietnam was divided into two, where you had the communists in the north, the communist-supported regime underneath Ho Chi Minh, and the free South Vietnam, settled in the Geneva Accords. And just like we had NATO, which was the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, we started SEATO, which was the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization, where basically an attack on one would be seen as an attack on all, even though it was never really as strong as the NATO alliance was. Ready for the next slide? Well, who gets elected president of South Vietnam? Why, it's Ngo Dinh Diem. And he was a Catholic. He was raised or went to college in America. And in 1956, there was supposed to be an election held that was going to unify the country. Either it was going to go communist with the North, or the South would win. And Diem totally calls off the elections. Now, why would he refuse to have elections? Because, guys, he knew he would lose. And in response to this, you have the Viet Cong, or the NLF, rise up to fight against him and to unite Vietnam as one country. NLF, by the way, is the National Liberation Front. Ready to go to the next slide? Eisenhower's second term. Ready to go to the next slide? The election of 1956, guys, everybody liked Ike. So pretty much he wins again. Same song, different verse. But we do have problems during this time, especially in the Middle East. where our policy of liberation, which had really helped out Egypt, suddenly went wrong on us, and Egypt sided with the Soviet Union, and they decide they want to kick England out of owning the Suez Canal. And they are able to successfully do that. But tensions between the U.S. and Soviets bring the fight to a close after the Suez Canal is won by Egypt. Meanwhile, Hungary, they were in the Soviet bloc. They took slow steps to get out of their union with the Soviet Union by withdrawing from the Warsaw Pact, which was kind of like NATO for the USSR. How did the Soviets respond? Well, the Soviets responded by not doing anything. Not doing anything. Meanwhile, the whole time they're moving their army down there in the railroad trains. And 2 weeks after they do it, they pretty much crush the opposition. A huge military overthrow in Bucharest. Indeed, the brother of the music teacher, one of my ex-wife's first schools that she taught at, his brother was actually killed in the Bucharest uprising, prompting him to later on, he played the cello very good, and when the Soviet orchestra was in Italy, he defected to the United States, or to the U.S. Embassy. Now, how did America respond to this? We couldn't really do anything. So we didn't do anything. Because if we had supported them, it would have started World War III. Ready for the next slide? Domestic affairs. Well, guys, all of a sudden on October 1st, 1957, something happens that shocks America. A little thing about the size of a basketball let out a beep, 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 beep as it orbited the Earth 28 times. Guys, the Soviets had gotten the first satellite into space, and they called it Sputnik, or the Traveler. Now, guys, what's the threat about the Soviets being able to put a satellite into space? Well, guys, if they can do that, then they can do it with nuclear warheads. So we have this whole big, huge space race that begins. NASA, or the National Aeronautical Space Administration, is formed. Defense spending goes through the roof. The National Defense Education Act of 1958 promotes a lot of the STEM sciences, like math and science. What are the results for Eisenhower? Well, his popularity went down. And as the government is now throwing money around, as you can guess, corruption goes through the roof. And Eisenhower gets very little support from the legislative branch. Ready for the next slide? Problems on the horizon. Well, in Lebanon, basically Iraq is moving in. They want to expand their power. What are the consequences for Lebanon? Well, we send money to them. We send in the Marines until stability can return to Lebanon. Because remember, guys, Lebanon, especially Beirut, it was so beautiful, so tranquil in the 1950s that Beirut was known as the Paris of the Mediterranean. And as soon as stability comes and Iraq pulls out, basically we pull out the American Marines. Meanwhile, in West Berlin, you have Khrushchev, who, like Eisenhower, also is a war hero, or was a war hero in Russia. He was there at the, he was a propaganda minister at the siege of Stalingrad, making sure that people were getting taken care of, making sure that propaganda was being put out, that Pravda was still in print. And even though there were threats between the two, basically they tried to have a peaceful coexistence. Because they knew, especially with massive retaliation, what might happen if they couldn't get along together. Getting ready to go to the next slide. Now, they were supposed to have a summit meeting, and everything was supposed to go good, which is when we get the U2 summit. Basically, guys, we didn't have satellites, so we had to get all of our reconnaissance of what's going on in Russia by sending U2 spy planes, which kind of look like the X-Men's plane, if you've ever seen an X-Men movie. And a flight had been planned. It was a 14-hour-long flight. Basically, it was going to take off in Japan and land in Turkey, taking pictures of the Soviet Union all the while it's over it. Now, we didn't, even though we didn't really have to have this flight, America felt safe in using these planes because our planes could fly higher and faster than any Soviet missile. Well, that is, they used to. Then apparently they got a new missile. By the way, a lot of conspiracy people really like to point out that this was the period that Oswald had defected to the Soviet Union, when all of a sudden this new missile comes out. Anyway, this new missile is launched and it hits the spy plane. Well, Gary Powers, who's the pilot, remember, before they take off, they have to take off all jewelry, anything that can identify them as a U.S. citizen. Then, they're given a cyanide pill that they're supposed to bite into and commit suicide after self-destructing the plane so that Russia won't have any evidence of what America had done. Well, some problems happen. First off, when the missile hits the U-2, it destroys the self-destruct mechanism, and Gary Powers, who jumps out of the airplane and is on his parachute ride down, decides, you know what? I don't want to die. I think I want to live. And he doesn't bite into his cyanide pill. So the Soviets catch him, catch him alive. Basically, they have all the wreckage. And they give America a call saying, guys, you want to tell us a little bit about this spy plane? And in America, we think that it's been destroyed and that Gary Powers had committed suicide like he should have. So we say, what are you talking about? We don't know anything. And they're like, guys, we have Gary Powers. We have the plane. We know everything. So this caused a huge rift between the relationship between Khrushchev and Eisenhower. By the way, Gary Powers, we trade him for some Soviet spies in Berlin. As they go across the bridge. Gary Powers, of course, is kicked out of the military. He comes back here to the U.S., where he is a helicopter pilot for a TV and radio station. And he's that for 6 months till he dies in a helicopter accident. Okay, next slide. So things between us and the Soviets are heating up. Meanwhile, down in Cuba, you have Castro that takes over from Bautista. And at first, we're excited about him. And we think, hey, we're going to have a new ally down there. Well, and like I said, we're excited to have him. We want to offer support, everything like that, until the Cubans decide, ready for the next slide, that they can get a better deal from the Soviets. And that's the end.